Hello, thanks for joining me again. Just painting here on a 30 by 36 canvas. This is actually a watercolor canvas. I like it because it's a lot smoother and softer to paint on. I'm just bringing in this little bit of a background color here. We're going to be painting some sea turtles, so I'm just starting off by creating some coral and some rock here for our background, and just using this filbert brush, a little bit larger filbert brush, but I wanted to create a lot of form and shape here. So I've mixed together a cerulean blue and a Prussian blue to kind of create this kind of a bluish, darker bluish kind of coral, and just kind of figure out where I want to have all this real quickly here. So I'm just going to have a lot of form and shape and variety with this, and as I begin to push that back into the distance, I've just added a little bit more titanium white and some umber to that blue mixture, and I'm just sort of scumbling on some various shapes here now. So I'm not being very careful or deliberate. This is really just kind of splashing this color on and having some good brush strokes as well. So just adding a lot of variety here, and sort of just skipping around. A lot of this is going to be covered with a small, thin glaze of paint, and that'll help to soften it. So I'm going to paint this painting all in acrylic, and so with that, I'm going to be using a series of washes and glazes that you'll see me use quite a bit through the painting, and that'll help to really soften those brush strokes and help to really push off into the distance a lot of this background rock and stone and coral and everything that I'm trying to paint in right now. But for now, I'm just kind of bringing in a little bit more shape and variety, some more highlights, get those kind of established right now, so the light source will be coming from the left of the painting. And I'll bring that in, and then I'll introduce some of those glazes that will be very transparent, and a lot of this detail will show through. So getting that established here early right now is kind of what I want to do. So I thought I'd go ahead and paint some sea turtles. I've painted sea turtles in the past. They've been very popular. I just did an art festival here last month, and I think the sea turtles that I painted were probably one of the more popular features at the show. So I thought I might try to do some, but this time I wanted to kind of make them a little bit more realistic than the last time. Last time they were just very colorful, and you just don't typically find turtles quite that colorful in nature. So thought I would try to go ahead and do it again this time, but with a little bit more realism. So I'm here just still trying to bring in some of this silver lining here that we're going to see. And once we get this all kind of put into place, I'm going to use some of that blue mixture and create a wash out of it, kind of a 50-50. I'll use about 50% water and 50% of paint, and that'll keep it transparent enough that I can go ahead and start to cover this background and really start to help with kind of changing the value and creating some depth and distance. So here I am just glazing that blue color over the paint, and that's really softening it and really creating some nice distance here. So I'll kind of go all over this with that wash. And that'll give us the illusion that this is nice and distant. And that'll really help our sea turtles to really push them forward and pop out at us. So just kind of going back again a second time with some more glazes, and now I can come back with my rigger brush and then go back on top of that, because you see the glaze again, it kind of desaturated everything, so it kind of graded out, and now I can come back with more saturated color. And in this case it's just teal. I have a teal with a little bit of titanium white, and I can start to draw out more of that silver lining again, but I'm kind of skipping around a little bit more. I'm letting a lot of that underpainting show through, so I'm really paying attention to my negative space. You don't want to destroy all that hard work you've done. And as I go back into the more distant background, I've just taken that same teal color and I've sort of darkened it a little bit more with some umber. That way as it recedes, it'll sort of just kind of get a little bit less bold and a little bit less detail. And that's really important. You want to keep your backgrounds very cool in color and just have less detail. That'll help to sell the illusion that things are really receding off into the distance. Now I'm coming back with some pure white, and I'm just kind of adding just a teeny little bit of pure white, just a little bitty specks of it. And I'm not doing too much. It's important not to do too much because it can really overpower the painting and you won't like it. So I'm using black gesso. I prefer black gesso oftentimes over black acrylic paint because it's just got better pigment and I can get some better coverage very, very quickly. I don't have to continue to go over it again and again. So that's what this is. It'll get on there and it'll dry very quickly, and I'll be able to continue along with my turtles. So I want to get this kind of established really quickly. And then I've got my airbrush. I wanted to bring in some of those light shafts that are kind of beaming, light beams that are kind of showing through with my airbrush. I'm using an emerald green acrylic paint for the airbrush and just splashing that on really quickly. Get that all taken care of. We'll let that dry, and then I'll sketch on my turtles. A very simple, basic sketch. And there's my turtle. So I've got that kind of figured out. I wanted to get these guys in pretty quickly because I wanted to establish where they're going to be in the painting. And once I have an idea about that, then I can begin to build the background and the foreground around the turtles much easier. Now what you're going to notice is I'm going to paint this turtle all in black and white and gray. So I'm not even concerned about color at this stage. So this is kind of a newer technique I've started using. I was experimenting and thought it'd be nice if I started kind of working on top of very muted kind of tones, almost like sepia tone, but with black and white and gray. So very neutral colors, and that will be my sort of my underpainting. And then I could add my detail on top of that. Again, not worried about color, but bringing in the detail early, and then I'll start using a series of glazes and start layering color on top of that. The glazes will help me to establish the color. And this is sort of an old master technique. A lot of the old masters used to paint this way, where they would either use earth tones or sepia tones or black and white or some sort of neutral color, and then build layers of color on top of it later. And so my old style would be to kind of think about the colors first and then add the detail later. This time I'm just kind of reversing everything. I'm worried about less about the color, more about the detail, and I'll bring the color in later. And then on top of those glazes I can add more precision and more detail. But at this point, it's just important for me to sort of establish where my lights and shadows are. Colors are irrelevant. So form the lights and the shadows. Start figuring out the detail, and that'll sort of be my underpainting. And then I'll begin to bring in washes of color on top of that. Now the glazes I'm using, just like I did with the background, it will be 50-50 water to paint. And I'll just let this all dry. You want to make sure it's completely dry before you do this, otherwise you're going to start to create mud. But because we're painting in acrylic, it'll dry very quickly, which is nice. So I just have to wait a few minutes, or I can get my blow dryer and I can dry it really quickly that way, and then I can continue to keep working and adding glazes. So I'm just kind of re-going over the turtle with some more color on top of that. Get rid of some of those brush strokes. I can start with my second turtle now. This will be just a repeat of what I just did. It'll be in black and white and gray. And I'll look at bringing in some of the highlights, look at some of the shadows, and then I can start bringing in detail and have all this established before I start those glazes. And I just wanted to know where I was going to be putting these turtles. That was really the important thing. And then I can start to build around everything. So I want to kind of think about where the some of the separation in the shell of our turtle is going to be. Just kind of paint those in really quickly. And I'm just blocking this in with an angle brush. Pretty nice brushes, because I can get large surfaces covered. I can also use the point of the brush if I need to have something a little bit smaller and more refined. So it's just a good kind of block-in brush to use. And just pretty handy. And sea turtles are kind of a fun subject matter to paint. They're challenging. They've got a lot of detail. And I just thought it'd be a fun challenge to bring these in. Plus, I'm doing this show here in a couple months, this art festival, and it seems like these turtles are always a big hit. So it might help me to be able to sell this. Who knows? All right, so now I'm kind of establishing those lights and shadows, bringing in a little bit more of the paint, but keeping in mind that I really don't care what the colors are right now. I could have done all this in earth tone browns. I could have done it all in kind of green tones. It doesn't matter. I just decided to use black and white and gray, but that's all that matters. Just get it all figured out and blocked in. Now I can start to work on the coral, and I'm using I'm using a filbert brush. This is a very small filbert brush. And I like filbert brushes because I can really soften with them, and I'm just dry brushing this on because I wanted to keep a lot of this in silhouette. have a lot of the shadow predominantly showing through. So I can just bring this in real quickly, kind of dry brush it on, add a little bit of detail, and I'll even do some glazing over the foreground coral as well, and some of the rocks that I'm kind of creating here on the seabed. But see, now that I've got the turtle in place, I kind of know where I can paint around him and not have to do too much unnecessary painting that will just simply get covered up by our turtles. So that was kind of the method behind the madness in choosing to do it this way. I got some of my reference photos. There's a couple locations that I like to either purchase reference photos, or there's even some that you can get free images. But wildlife reference photos, I think one of the turtles I purchased from wildlife reference photos, not too expensive. I think I paid like $5. You can also go to like Pixabay or Unsplash, or a couple where you can get some free images even, or you can make a donation, but you can get images that don't have any copyright infringements or anything, and that's where I went and purchased my reference photos for these turtles. All right, so now that I've kind of got that basically established on the coral, I didn't show it, but I did put a small wash of burnt sienna over the coral here on the foreground just to kind of warm things up. You'll see me in a few minutes. I'll bring in some more washes again. I'll bring in some more sienna. I'll even bring in some black washes because I just need to kind of establish a little bit darker shadowing in certain areas. But right now I just want to get this all put in here real quickly, some basic minor detail, let that get dry, and then I can come back with my glazes. And I chose to use sienna just because it's kind of a warmer brown color. It's got a little bit of orange or red into it. But typically is in the foreground, things are typically warmer, and as they recede, they get a little cooler in color, and that'll help to kind of establish that background a little better, push everything back. This is where I'm bringing in black glaze, so I'm just washing that over real quickly, and then I'm coming back with some more sienna, and I'm kind of warming some things up a little bit more. So just pretty simple kind of washes there. And now we can begin our turtles in earnest. So the first thing is, now that I've got the basic shape all in black and white and gray, I can start to bring in the detail. So there's going to be a lot of lines and folds, wrinkles in the skin. I just kind of want to get that all figured out real quick here and start to build on the detail. Once again, I'm not overly concerned about the color. So I've mixed some kind of gray blues, gray greens. I've kind of got a couple piles of those colors pre-mixed and kind of ready to go. I'm bringing in pure white here because I want to start to form some shapes. These sea turtles tend to have just a lot of different things going on the shell. There's splotches, and there's like kind of like little marks that are horizontal and vertical, and they kind of just do all sorts of stuff. So I wanted to get that kind of figured out real quickly here, and then going into the flipper, kind of the same thing with the flipper, just dry brush on, a little bit of color, a little bit of variety, but I'm still staying in those neutral tones. Not really concerned about the color now. And so this is really kind of the reverse of how I've done it in the past, but by introducing early on all the detail, having those thin glazes of color will still preserve all that detail on the underpainting. So I still kind of consider this all my underpainting, even though I'm starting to get a little more precise and bringing in all sorts of different brush strokes and different marks that I just want to be able to have ready to go. Kind of bringing in some more dark. This is just black paint. I'm kind of jumping around and adding some of that as well. But at this stage, I'm not even thinking too much about lights and shadows at this moment in time. I'll glaze that on mostly at the end, but I just want to figure out kind of where all these little shapes and varieties are going to be right now. And this is my first wash. And you can see how it's so transparent that it just preserves all those brush strokes underneath. So I'm just kind of using a little bit of a blue-green wash here. It's very transparent. Bring in some black, kind of start to form my shadows. This is where I can start to think about highlights and shadows now. I can glaze those on real quickly, and I can kind of bounce around. I got a little bit lighter green, more of a sap green glaze now. I can glaze on a little bit of brown. So this is where I can start to establish color. I'll glaze it on, and what you'll see happen is that it'll also desaturate everything as well. It'll soften. It softens a lot of my marks. And now I can come back with my filbert brush, and I can begin to dry brush on additional highlights, additional colors on top of that. You'll want to, of course, let your glaze dry. That won't take too long because it's a pretty thin wash. So just take a few minutes, let that dry, and come back again and start adding on additional brush strokes of color. And now I'm beginning to think more about my colors. Now I'm bringing in yellow ochre a little bit, splashing that on. I'll kind of change the values of that a little bit, highlight with a little bit of white, lighten that up a little bit. I might desaturate some colors by adding a little bit of some umbers. But now I can really think about more shape and variety, more color. I'll put it on top of that glaze, and then what you're going to see me do is I'll bring in some more glazes. So this technique is going to be one of layering upon layers of color. Lots of layers. But since we're working in acrylic, and acrylic dries very fast, I find that a really good way to soften those hard edges is by doing these glazes. And that helps to create some realism. I can begin to really start to highlight the shell here now by adding in some more yellow greens and a little bit more ochres. Now I'll begin to sort of lose some of my underpainting. They'll start to really lighten up. I can still see them, of course, but I'll need to come back and bring in some of those lines again, that I've lost some of the lines. But I don't need to bring all the lines back because you can still see them. They're just really soft and they're a little desaturated, and I want to kind of keep some of that. And if I want to embolden others, I can bring in kind of harder edges and deeper, darker lines. And that also kind of aids in that realism. It also helps to create some dimension. So now I can kind of bring all that back in again. And I'm using small brushes so I can have a lot of control in where the brush stroke goes and creating some of those finer details. I start to bounce around some more color. I'm bringing on some more splotches, different shapes. I'm beginning to add on some reflected highlight now underneath the head and the neck and the chest region. And then I'll bring in another glaze to reintroduce some more of those shadows again, because I'll start to lose some of my shadowing a little bit, and I want to kind of reestablish that. So really that's kind of the method, is just kind of apply some color, bring in some detail, then apply some more glazes, and just kind of push and pull a lot of these brush strokes and with a lot of layers of color. And this is kind of how I like to kind of create some of that realism. So I can come back and start doing a little bit more refining, bring a little bit more detail to our turtle. Be a little bit more accurate now. And in those shadow regions, I'm kind of bringing in some more kind of blue-greens, kind of keeping the color cool. And then I get a little bit more ochre and yellows and browns kind of in those highlight areas. That'll also help with the creation of some form and variety, keeping our separation of lights and darks. It'll create some nice contrast as well. Kind of work on our eye a little bit here, have a little bit of reflection in the eye. Now I can really start to bring out some of the separation. I'm using some titanium mixed with a little bit of teal, but a little titanium with some teal. So it's not pure white necessarily, but those highlights I can kind of hit at the top of the head where I think that the light source will be striking those areas, and then kind of keeping them cooler with more blue greens as I move down toward the base of our turtle. Now I'm kind of hitting that refining point where I can come back now and really start to zero in on a little bit more refined detail. Bring a little bit more color now. And really try to get in some of those highlights. I'm kind of glazing on a little bit more color, some greens, and bring in some silver lining now. We're going to have a little bit of silver lining on that flipper, a little bit on the top of the shell and on the head of our turtle, on his little flippers in the back as well. Kind of get that figured out. And then once I've got all this on, I can get that final glaze of shadow, which in this case I'll just use just black, and I'll mix that 50-50 water to black paint, and I can start to glaze that into the shadow areas of our turtle, and that'll really help to pop him out, and he'll have a lot of nice form and kind of three-dimensionality. So this is my glaze I'm bringing right now. I'm just kind of darkening things up, and that really starts to really bring out the dimension now. And I'll continue to play with him a little bit as I move along the painting. I'll come back and kind of revisit and do some more refining, bring in some better definition. But for the most part, that kind of completes the turtle here on the foreground. We'll start his friend in the back here, and we'll do the exact same technique with him in the back, which you can kind of see how you can go from black and white to having something very vibrant. All right, so we're going to repeat the process now with this turtle. And I wanted to just use some different colors. I made our first turtle mostly kind of green and blue-green and so forth. And we're going to have this guy a little bit more with brown, but he's going to be mostly reflected highlight, because we have that vantage point where we're kind of looking up at the turtle so we can see his underbelly. And all that underbelly is actually not facing the light source. It's just reflecting light from the seabed. And so it's going to be a lot of blue greens and teal colors, but I want to go ahead and kind of begin to establish a little bit of color here on the top of the head early on. It's going to be a lot of burnt sienna, burnt umber, cad orange, whites, a little bit of yellows. So I'm going to use those colors, those warmer colors here at the top. I'm just going to kind of draw that in real quickly, paint that in real quickly, start to establish some basic detail. And then we'll start bringing in those glazes afterward. We'll start here on the head, and I'll just kind of take a little bit of time here now to really bring in some of that extra detail. Now I'm being a little bit more thoughtful about the color at this point. The rest of the turtle, I don't really care so much about the color at this point, but because we're working the top of the head, and this is going to be the part that is most getting highlighted by the light source, I just want to take a little bit of extra time and really bring in some good detail here. It'll still get covered up with a glaze, but the glaze will be such a thin, transparent wash that luckily we're not going to lose any of this detail. So I can kind of establish where those armor plating are going to be. Start working in some more detail here underneath on his jaw. But not so concerned about the color now. I just want to bring in the detail. I want to bring in all those skin folds, all those wrinkles. These sea turtles have a lot of them. And so using my rigger brush, I'm just trying to be pretty thoughtful about using that reference photo and looking about exactly how the shape. Got to think about the contour, that they follow the contour of the turtle's body. So you got to be aware that as you paint, you're always going to go through ugly phases. Phases where things just don't look good, and you might get disheartened, but just remember that there's always the ugly phase, and you got to persevere. Just work through it. Right now, this is kind of the ugly phase for me. It doesn't look like a whole lot right now, and it'll even begin to look worse as I start to keep working this and bringing in all the kind of the groundwork. So you got to really kind of think ahead about where you're headed with all of this. So right now, I just bring in all the detail. But because there's really no value system applied, there's no color applied so very much right now. It's pretty neutral. It's not going to look all that good. And that's expected. So you kind of get through that, work through it, and don't get disheartened. It's just the natural process of painting. You're always going to have that ugly period, as I like to call it. But just be patient, and it'll start to come alive. So once again, just not too concerned about the color. I'll get this put in real fast, get this little bit of detail, and then we'll begin washing over some glazes. Like right here, for example, I'm using pure white, which you typically don't do too often in a painting unless it's just like an accent color. But I'm using it now because I know I'm going to wash over it. I know it's going to change the value. It's going to desaturate the color quite a bit. And so I'm not too concerned. I just want to establish that there's going to be some highlight. So I'm thinking ahead. There's going to be some highlight here, but I'm going to change the saturation. It's going to really darken everything when I introduce those glazes. So yeah, this is the ugly phase. Like I said, doesn't look like much right now, but you just got to keep working at it. It'll start to slowly come alive. So as I said, I guess it was last month. Last month I did an art festival, and I had my my first turtle painting, which I did several episodes ago, and if you've not had a chance to see it, I encourage you to look at it. This is my first glaze, I'll just mention. So I have like this teal color that I have. It's very transparent. I've mixed just water, 50-50 with water. And that's the first glaze. And then I can start to work over that glaze with some more detail. You can see how everything's kind of been softened a little bit now, and some of those hard edges have been kind of removed. I can glaze on some dark color now. This is me just glazing on some black. And I can start to establish shadow from light and get that all kind of put in here early, and then I can start to build on top of it. And this will help me with creating that form. But as I was mentioning, I did these turtles several episodes ago. If you've not seen it, you can check it out on the YouTube page. But they were really popular at the art festival. I think it's probably one of my more popular of all the paintings. I think I brought about 42 or 43 paintings with me to sell at the festival. And yeah, the turtles were by far the most popular. And actually, I didn't even sell the turtles. I think that the festival I was at was actually also coupled with a craft fair. And I tend to see that oftentimes art festivals and craft fairs combined together are not always the most conducive shows to do for selling fine art. But I did luckily sell some pieces, which was great. But the turtles really drew in a lot of people. I just think it was past their price point. Plus, they're huge. I painted them on the 3 foot by 4 foot canvas, so some folks just didn't think they even had the wall space for it. But so popular, I thought, okay, I'm gonna do this again, except this time I'm painting on a smaller 30 by 36 canvas. And I'll try to make them a little bit more realistic, because last time I just put a lot of color into them, things that you don't typically naturally see in nature. So wanted to go back and do some more turtles this time, but kind of make them a little more realistic. Here I'm putting another green glaze this time. This is a little bit more of a sap green glaze. And let that dry, and as that's drying, I can kind of work on this neck a little bit more. Start to draw out some reflected highlight and bring in a little bit more form. Get a little bit of a silver lining here now. And then we can start to paint in this first flipper. So I'll have to just come in here now and bring a little bit more of those bluish teal colors, because I want to just keep thinking about, that reflected highlight, but there's still going to be a lot of detail and color, even though it's in shadow. I've put together this kind of a Prussian blue and teal mixture, kind of bring in some modeling effect here a little bit on the underside of the flipper. And I'm kind of trying to stay fairly accurate to my reference photo, but I do digress a little bit and kind of use a little bit of a license. I tend to not use the reference photos to 100% accuracy, because sometimes I don't think it really matches with the rest of the painting. So in this case, since these turtles are kind of floating in this nice kind of aqua bluish environment, you want to make sure that you're kind of reflecting some of that color into your subject. That way it all kind of ties together a little bit. Now I can start working on the other flipper here, and I can start to establish some basic shapes and and colors. Start to work around that glaze a little bit more. And I'll bring this in, I'll add the color on top, I'll add the detail on top, kind of saturating a little bit more of the colors, and then I'll go back and reglaze again and kind of push back and desaturate some colors again. And it's just a process of pushing and pulling color, but because you're layering color on top of each other, and since you're using acrylic, it really helps to create some vibrancy, which I think is nice, because when you typically work in acrylic, what you'll find is that when the water evaporates from the color and it starts to dry, it starts to darken a couple shades. You'll notice that you apply the wet paint, it looks pretty vibrant. All of a sudden it kind of gets dry and it gets dull. But if you begin to layer color on top of itself, it starts to hold on to that vibrancy better. And that's kind of one of those little secrets to using acrylic, that if used properly, you can almost make it appear like an oil painting to some degree. Now, it's very hard to achieve that vividness and vibrancy that you get with oil paint, which is oftentimes why I will go over an acrylic painting with some oil. Now, I didn't do that this time. I just wanted this to be an acrylic painting. But there's a lot of virtue that comes with using oils, and there's lots of virtues with acrylic, but they both have their vices too, right? We all know that oil tends to dry a lot longer. And if you want to create layers of paint and you want to do glazes of paint, you're having to wait quite a long time, typically hours or sometimes even days, before you can get back and redo this. And so that's why I like to bring all this in acrylic first. Now I'm starting to bring in some more lime greens now, and just kind of refining some of the reflected highlight a little bit more. I wanted to bring in some more oranges because the orange is the complement color to all of this blue. And so, I'm kind of thinking about trying to bring in some complement colors too, which will really help to tie everything sort of together. And it's a little more naturally pleasing to the eye. So we have a little bit more orange up into the shell and a little bit more into the top of his head and some of his neckline. But most of this will just be in shadow. It'll be reflected highlights in shadow. So I'm using a lot of cool colors, cool blues and greens. And that'll help to create that illusion. So we know that shadow areas are typically cool colors, and the warmer colors can typically be more used in the foregrounds and for some of those highlighted areas. But they'll tend to complement each other, and then you can have that nice contrast. So I'm kind of working the back of this shell here. There's some reflected highlighting going on here too. So I'm just kind of bringing in some oranges and kind of created a gold color using some of that yellow ochre as well. And I can just jump back and forth between my highlights and my reflected highlights, between my shadows and my light regions, and we can start to create some nice contrast here. And once again, I'll come back with some glazes and I'll really establish my lights from my darks. Now the glazes are mostly used for shadow. It's very hard to glaze with trying to do highlights because you tend to lose the detail. When you have to glaze highlights, you typically need to make it a little more opaque, which means you're using some more of your titanium white to kind of lighten that up. But titanium white is usually a very opaque color, so it's harder to glaze that way because you'll begin to lose a lot of the underpainting detail. So I just kind of wanted to warn you about that. So usually when you glaze, you want to use very transparent colors, and use them more for kind of your shadows. So just kind of think about that. But I like the glazing technique because, again, it will soften, it will desaturate, it will help to push things kind of back a little more muted. And then when I build on top of that with color, with opaque color, I can bring back that detail on top of that, and then it all ties together very nicely doing that. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a newer approach to painting, painting anything really. But with these animals, it's kind of a newer approach that I've began taking, but I really like the result. And I was just kind of experimenting on this, and I was watching some tutorial videos of other people kind of doing the same thing. I wanted to see how they were achieving it. So, I'm self-taught, so I'm always just a student trying to learn. I never studied art in school, studied business actually, so I've just had to, learn where I can learn. All right, so we're starting to work through that ugly phase now. It's starting to actually take some shape and become something. I'm beginning to bring in some more scumbled dry brush technique here. I'm just dry brushing on some darker color now, some darker greens, and I'm starting to establish some silver lining and help me to create some separation in the these plates on the shell. So I'm really just kind of jumping around now, but what I'm needing to do is kind of step back at this point and begin the refining phase. So this will begin the phase where I can really start to add some detail and work on top of those glazes. And I'll add a final glaze here of my shadow here at the end, but by kind of re-establishing where some of these harder edges are now, but still hanging on to the softer edges that we've created with the glazes. You don't want to kill all that. You just want to complement and work with it. But this will help to start to create a little bit more of that realism. And so once again, you're just kind of pushing and pulling color. Here's another glaze. I'm using Prussian blue. Kind of go over that real quickly with the soft glaze. Kind of starts to desaturate everything a little bit more. Like I said, if I lose it, I can always bring it back. But I really want to start to establish our shadows now. Underneath the neck, underneath the belly, underneath each of those flippers a little bit more. So this will be kind of one of those final glazes. Then I can come back and begin to add, once again, more of that detail. And this will begin my tonal best. So I can really bring in some more saturation now. But I'm not killing all that desaturation. That desaturation is really important. You want to use both saturation and desaturation. So you're not, you're looking at negative space. I'm looking at all my negative space. I'm making sure I'm retaining a lot of that underpainting. And I'm just complementing it by going over it again with more saturated color and being very precise and thoughtful about where it's going. And I can bring in those final highlights. On our little turtle, I can dry brush back on some more of that reflected highlight, because I did kind of lose it a little bit with bringing on the glazes, which was expected. So there's a bit of a method to the madness here, but at this point in time, our little turtle is really beginning to finally take some shape and is actually starting to look like something. But you had to be aware to persevere through the ugly phase of all that, and then it starts to pay off here in the end. So I really like this technique that I've kind of stumbled upon. I think I'm going to continue to use it. If you remember a couple episodes ago, I did the snow tiger. That snow tiger was the first time I'd ever tried the glazing technique in layering paint, layering lots of color. And I really liked it. It works very, very well for fur and hair, and it also seems to work very well for turtles too. So I think it can be applied to most any subject, and I really liked that, and I thought that it really held on to the vibrancy pretty well. You know, even though it's acrylic paint that tends to dry darker, it seemed to hold on to the vibrancy. So a lot of fun, and I hope that here in the next month or two, when I go to this art festival, that this will be a popular painting with everybody, and it might sell. That'll be great. I'm starting to come to the end now. I'm coming to that refining point at this point in time, and I could just kind of step back and look at the painting, make some decisions, go back and kind of play with some things. I even played with these turtles off camera too, because I'd get away for a day or so and not really look at them and come back and see something else, and so I'd want to go back and kind of play with it. But you don't want to overwork it either. You got to be careful not to overwork it. But yeah, you know, this finally started really taking some shape, and had a lot of fun with this turtle here, putting it together. So we'll get some of these final little marks here kind of coming in. I'm just kind of bringing in a little bit more umber and a little more ochre a little bit here on this reflected area. Want to bring in some fish. You know, we have to have some fish. There's just going to be in silhouette, so not a whole lot of detail really, but wanted to get that brought in as well. And that'll help to kind of complete the painting. Added some teal colors so that it looks like some of these are getting highlighted in those little sun shafts that are coming down. And just do those to a couple of them. A little bit of highlight here. Then you'll see me come back and I'll start to kind of work on the coral a little bit more on the foreground. I'll just bring in a little bit more detail there as well. And this is just kind of how I finish off the painting. I appreciate you tuning in. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. And I'll look forward to coming back here with another tutorial video very soon. I'm still trying to think about what I want to demonstrate. But if you like the video, please share it. That way I can grow my community a little bit. And hopefully this painting was helpful and might have lent to your own knowledge, and maybe you can try some of these techniques as well and have some success with it. But I think I've had some good results, and I've appreciated learning some new things as well myself. This is me saying goodbye. So thanks so much for tuning in, and so long, everybody.